the grandmas and the aunties and the mentors and the women who invest in other women. Whoever you are, thank you for who you are and for what you do today. We really want to honour that. Hey, a shameless plug before we get into God's Word. But last year I had the privilege of publishing my first book, which was a really fun and exciting adventure. It's called I Am Jonah. And it walks through the book of Jonah in the Old Testament, the story of the prophet who runs away from God. But the book of Jonah is actually read every year in Jewish synagogues all over the world on the holiest day of the Jewish calendar, which is Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And in some synagogues, when they get to the end of that reading, which takes about 15 minutes, when they get to the end, what they do in some synagogues is the entire congregation will stand to their feet, and together in unison they say 3 words. They say, "We are Jonah." And it's a reflection that actually you and I, we're not that different to this runaway prophet. And so what this book does is it journeys through the book of Jonah, piece by piece in the story, and at the end of each chapter, I stop and reflect on the different ways that I am just like Jonah in my life, and so are you. And so that's what the book explores, and we brought some with us. I think we've got about 20 copies sitting at the back, and my gorgeous wife, Rochelle, is going to be down there, and we don't want to take any back to Auckland. So if you can lighten our luggage, we would bless greatly. What a fantastic Mother's Day gift, by the way. Anyway, that's enough of that. But if you want to see that, if you're a reader and that would excite you, we would love to have a chat to you. Where is God? Where is God? That is often the question that we think of, or we may even say to someone or say to ourselves when life is really tough. You know, when you're sitting in a doctor's office and you get a diagnosis that you didn't expect, like cancer. When your marriage partner of however many years walks away from your marriage. When you stand at the graveside of someone you love and you watch their coffin go into the ground. When you turn up at work on Monday morning and you're handed a redundancy notice to say your job is coming to an end. When your prodigal slams the door and yells, "Never coming home," and leaves. There are times in each of our lives, aren't there, where we come to that moment and we go, where is God in the midst of all this? What is going on in my life? The photo there on the screen is a photo of the city of Bucharest, the capital of Romania, and it was taken early in the 1940s during World War II. In World War II, it seemed like in the first few years, Hitler and Nazi Germany was on the ascendancy, and so in 1940, the nation of Romania tied themselves in. They became allies of Nazi Germany. And so they took on all of Nazi Germany's policies, particularly against Jewish people. So a year later, in 1941, in the city of Bucharest, they began what became known in history as the Bucharest pogroms, where for night after night after night, gangs of gangs of Nazi sympathizers would roam around the city at night with clubs and bats, and they would hunt out every Jewish person they could find. And Jewish people who had lived in Romania for centuries were suddenly being hunted, they were beaten, they were raped, they were killed. In the middle of all of that, a young couple were on the run for their lives. They hadn't been married for too many years, and with them was a beautiful 3-year-old girl. And they were running from shadow to shadow, street to street, alley to alley, trying to keep away from the sounds of the gangs they could hear roaming through Bucharest, until they came to the realization that they may very well not survive that night. And so that young couple did something unthinkable. They took their 3-year-old daughter and they took her down an alleyway to where there was an apartment building at the end of the alley. And they got her to just sit down on the curb with a little bag and a nice warm jacket around her. And they sat her there and they gave her a hug and they said, "Darling, we'll be back in just a moment." And this couple left their little girl sitting on the sidewalk, and they walked down the alley and around the corner, and they never came back. They felt like the best chance for their daughter to live was for them to leave her alone. And I read this story a few summers ago in an amazing book called The Girl They Left Behind. It's a novel, but the author is the daughter of that little girl, telling her mother's story in a fictionalized way. And when she was discovered, just not too long, only a few minutes, by someone who lived in that apartment building and taken inside to get away from the danger and ended up in an orphanage and being adopted out and actually never seeing her parents again. In the book, they tell the story and say that the person who discovers this little girl sitting on the side of the street found a note tucked into the pocket of her jacket. Here's what the note said. In anguish and despair, we release this child into the hands of God with hope and faith that she may be saved. Where is God? Where is God? And all of the mothers sitting here, aren't you glad you came to church today to hear a story like that? Of a young mother who has to abandon her child. But the reality is that almost all of us in life to this point have asked that question at times, haven't we? Where's God in the middle of this? And if you haven't, you probably will at some point in the coming years. Where is God? And it's a question that's very apt as we come to a story in the Old Testament that I think is immensely powerful. It's found in Exodus chapter 2, so if you've got a Bible with you or an app on your phone and you want to follow along, you're welcome to do that. I'm going to also put some of the verses up on the screen as we go. But Exodus 2 is the story of the birth of one of the most important figures in the Old Testament, Moses, the deliverer of Israel in what we call the Exodus. And it's a story that's particularly pertinent for Mother's Day, not because of the story I just set you up with from Bucharest, Romania, but because there are three key characters in the story, and all of them are women. They are the champions of the story. The heroes are actually heroines. And it's a fabulous story that helps us think about this question, where are you, God? So it begins this way in Exodus chapter 2, verse 1. Now a man of the tribe of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. So a little boy is born in this story. And this couple, who's anonymous, we're not given their names, they get pregnant and they give birth to a little boy. Now normally that would be a moment of huge celebration, wouldn't it? That a baby has been born into this family. But in this particular moment of history, this is not a cause for celebration. This is a cause for despair. Because in the previous verse, right before this, in Exodus chapter 1, at the very end of that chapter, here's what we read. Oops, I've gone past, have I? No, I'm going the wrong way. There we go. Back in Exodus chapter 1, the previous verse, then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people. Pharaoh is the king of Egypt. Every Hebrew boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. You see, the people of Israel had gone down into Egypt hundreds of years before, but had now grown into this huge nation. And the Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, was terrified that this foreign people group in their midst would grow up and take over their land. And so they'd been enslaved now for the past few hundred years. But they continued to grow. They continued to have more babies, and they were flourishing as a people group. And this new Pharaoh comes along who's dead scared, and he tries all of these schemes to get rid of the danger that he was feeling from the Jewish people, and he couldn't, until he issues this genocidal order that he wants every single boy born from now on among the Jewish people to be killed. And the reason is because he's afraid that these little boys will grow up to become men and soldiers who will form a massive army and destroy the Egyptians and their people and their culture. And the irony of the whole story is that he is dead scared of the boys. He's not worried about the girls, he's worried about the boys. And this is a story where God's going to use the girls and the women to completely undermine his whole plan. But the problem is that this couple have just given birth at the very point in history where having a little Jewish boy is not a good thing. And so the mother has to take drastic action. So midway through verse 2, the story continues. When she saw that he was a fine child, we read, which always makes me smile, because that's what every mother thinks. Hey, you know, you're introduced to a newborn little baby and you think it looks like a prune, but you smile because the mother thinks he's a fine-looking child. So she thinks he's a fine child, so she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket, reeds, for him, and she coated it with tar and pitch to make it waterproof, and she placed the child in it, and she put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. So as I said, there's three main characters in the story. All of them are women, and what's fascinating is all of them are anonymous. We are given no names in this story until the very end, where we're told that the little boy will be called Moses. But the heroines of the story are not named. They're just these anonymous women who, in a sense, almost represent all women and what God can do through you. And so in this case, we begin with this mother who, notice, hides a newborn baby for 3 months. Now, if you're a parent and you've had newborn babies in your home, you know what a hard season that is. Those first 3 months, like you're not even getting proper sleep, and you've got this newborn you're trying to work out what to do with, and it's crying and pooping and feeding, and you're exhausted. Now imagine all of that and the threat that at any moment Egyptian soldiers could burst through your door and put a spear right through your infant. I mean, every time that little baby gurgled or moved or whimpered or anything, they must have been quiet, trying to settle this thing. And that must have been utterly even more exhausting than being a parent of a newborn anyway. It was an immensely stressful time. And it gets to the 3-month mark, and this mother decides we've got to do something drastic here. And so she takes a basket and waterproofs it, and she puts her baby in there, and she takes him down to the Nile River. Now, one of my all-time favorite animated movies is The Prince of Egypt. Who's seen The Prince of Egypt? There's a better proportion at the 11 o'clock service than 9. It was disappointing at 9, I have to say. But there's still a whole lot of you who haven't seen it, so your job this afternoon is to go home and watch the Prince of Egypt movie. Because it's outstanding. They do such a cool job of portraying the story of the Exodus and the story of Moses. But there's a couple of moments in the movie that I don't like how they've portrayed it, and this is one of them. Because what happens in the movie, there's this beautiful, the mother is singing this beautiful song, and she gathers up this little baby that we now know as Moses, and she places him in the basket. And in the movie, what she does is she wades out into the Nile River about waist deep. And then the basket's floating on and she pushes this thing out into the Nile. So it's floating down the middle of the Nile, and here's a picture from what it looks like in the movie. And there's crocodiles, and there's hippos, and there's boats, and the oars are coming and knocking, and you think the thing's going to tip over, and Moses is going to die, and that's going to be the end of the movie, like only half an hour in. And it's horrendously stressful, and that is absolutely not what the text actually says. In fact, the text is very, very careful, because what kind of mother honestly would do that? Instead, here's what the text actually says. If we come back to verses 2 and 3, when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch, and she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds. Now, this is the NIV translation of the Bible, which is the translation I really, really like. But in this particular case, I don't like how they've translated verse 3, because they say she placed the child in the basket and then put it among the reeds. But in the original Hebrew text, it's the same verb. She placed the baby in the basket, and she placed the basket in the reeds. And that's important, because you think about how a mother would take an infant baby and so carefully lay him into a basket. And then with that same care, she carefully places that basket among the reeds. She's not wading out into the Nile and shoving the thing out among the crocodiles. She is carefully placing the basket with this precious life into the reeds. And then this mother does something utterly unbelievable. She walks away. Can you imagine how hard that was? We read the stories of the Bible and we forget these are real people who actually lived through this. And here is a mother of a 3-month-old infant who places her baby. She is so desperate and has no other plan. She places him in a basket and she turns and she walks away, and there must have been tears streaming down her cheeks as she did so. And I can imagine she goes home and she shuts the door of their little hovel of a house, and I imagine she just wails. She's left her little baby behind. And it doesn't take too much imagination, does it? To imagine that note from Bucharest in Romania in 1941 tucked into the pocket of that little girl. You could see that note, couldn't you? In the basket that Jewish mother left that day at the side of the River Nile. In anguish and despair, we release this child into the hands of God with hope and faith that he may be saved. Where's God in this kind of story? The mother, however, doesn't leave the baby completely alone. Instead, verse 4 tells us that his sister, her daughter, will remain there. And she's the second heroine of the story. Now, later on, we find in the story of Exodus, her name is Miriam. And she'll become one of the key leaders of the nation of Israel, a worship leader and a woman who's incredibly used by God. At this point, she's a girl. Best guess is she's 8 to 12 years old. Anything younger than that, it's unlikely her mum would have left her down by the river. Older than 12, she would have been an adult woman and probably enslaved and doing some work somewhere. So we're talking about a 9, 10, 11-year-old girl. And her mum leaves her there to keep watch and to see what will happen. So we have a mother and we have a sister, and then the third woman steps onto the scene. If you've got the story open in front of you, in a Bible or an app, have a look at verse 5 and look at the first 3 words. It says, then Pharaoh's daughter. Now, if you were reading this or hearing this for the very first time, you would have let out an audible gasp right now. Because if you stop and think about it, this is almost the worst possible scenario. The worst scenario would have been Pharaoh himself coming along. Second worst scenario is any member of the royal family. And you read the story, and the third person to step into the scene, the third person to come along, is no one less than one of the daughters of the very ruler who has ordered the genocide in the first place. And she walks into the scene. And at this moment, the story now begins to speed up. In verses 5 and 6, the verbs almost tumble over themselves. It says, Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank, and she saw the basket, and she sent her female slave, and she opened it, and she saw the baby, and behold, it was a baby boy. And it's like verb after verb after verb. It's suddenly speeding up the whole story as she sees this basket and sends a slave and gets it and brings it and opens it, and oh, it's a baby boy. And what do you think is going to happen at this point? I mean, if you've never heard this story before, there's multiple scenarios here right now. It could be that she's as ruthless as her father and totally believes in his genocidal policies, and she just picks that infant up by the heel and biffs him into the water. Yeah? That's one option. Another option is that she totally backs her father's policies, but she doesn't want to get her hands dirty, so she just summons the guards to take care of this little problem and get rid of it. Or she could be one of those people, actually she doesn't particularly like what her dad's ordered. But you know what? It's not her business. She just doesn't want to get involved. So she just kind of puts the baby back and puts the top back on and just wanders away and, pretends she hasn't seen anything. But she doesn't do any of that. Instead, here's what the text actually says. She saw, she sent, she got, she opened, she saw. Behold, it was a crying baby. And she had compassion on him. It's this beautiful line about a foreigner who knows nothing about the God of Israel. But she had compassion on this baby. We had 50 people here for a seminar yesterday all about the attributes of God and the character of God. And one of the verses, probably the verse I kept coming back to again and again and again and again in that seminar, is a vital passage in Exodus chapter 34, some chapters after this particular story, where God appears to Moses and he announces who he is. It's God's 1-minute introduction of himself. And it's this beautiful statement about his character and who he is, and it begins this way: Yahweh, Yahweh, the gracious and compassionate God. One of his core attributes is that God is a God of compassion. And here in this story, this foreign princess who doesn't even know the God of Israel exhibits this beautiful characteristic of God himself. She sees this baby boy, recognizes that he is one of the Hebrews, and she has compassion on him. And right at that moment, one of the other heroines of the story steps forward. This little girl, 8, 9, 10 years old, comes up and pulls on the sleeve of this princess or taps her on the shoulder and says to her, "Would you like me to go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse this baby for you?" She presumes that the princess wants to keep the baby, but the baby will need to be fed. And so this young girl just has the wisdom to step in right at the right moment and say to this incredibly important woman of Egypt, incredible power, would you like me to go find someone who would be able to breastfeed this baby for the next few years? The story continues in verses 8 to 10. The princess says, "Yes, go." So the girl went and got the baby's mother. Now just stop and imagine this. Imagine you're the mother. You've gone home. Shut the door. You are howling at this point. You have given up your precious child. And then the door flings open and your little girl comes running in. And you're like, "Why aren't you watching the baby?" And she's like, no, Mama, no, it's really good. An Egyptian princess has come. And you're like, "Oh no, surely not." She said, no, Mum, it's good. She wants to keep the baby. But she wants you to come and look after it for the next few years. And the mother's going, "Are you serious?" And goes running back down with her daughter. And so then the story continues. And Pharaoh's daughter said to the mother, "Take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you." So the Egyptian economy is now going to support this slave family to care for this little boy. And so the woman, the mother, got to take her baby home and nursed him. And when the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter and she adopted him as her son. In the ancient world, mothers would often breastfeed for at least 2 or 3 years. So what that means is that this little baby boy now grew up in the home, his family home, with his actual parents for the most formative and foundational years of his life. This little boy, who would be adopted and become a prince of Egypt, actually spent his most formative years with his birth parents, which means his native tongue would have not been Egyptian, it would have been Hebrew. It means he would have been raised on the stories of the God who created everything that is. He would have learnt about this God Yahweh and how he called their ancestors Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and made a promise to make them a nation. And that one day they would be enslaved in the land of Egypt for hundreds of years but would be released again. He grew up on that. The most formative years of his life were spent with his birth mother and birth father. And that's the home he got raised in for the first few years. Until finally the day came when the princess summoned her son to come to his new home. And so his birth mother would have taken her little toddler by the hand and led him to the Egyptian palace. And for the second time in her life, she would have had to say goodbye to her little boy and turned and walked away. And I reckon on that day there was still tears going down her cheeks again, but different kind of sadness, because he was safe and he would be cared for and he would be loved by this princess and he would be raised in the court of Egypt. And that was no small thing. When we get into the New Testament, one of the leaders of the early church, Stephen, will talk about this event in a speech to the religious leaders. And he would say when Moses was placed outside, Pharaoh's daughter took him and brought him up as her own son. And Moses was educated in all of the wisdom of the Egyptians. And he was powerful in speech and action. Which is ironic because you fast forward 80 years from Exodus 2, Moses is an 80-year-old shepherd on Mount Sinai who comes across a burning bush and hears the voice of Yahweh saying, "I want you to go back to Egypt from where you ran away 40 years ago, and I want you to lead my people out of slavery." And Moses will come up with 5 reasons why he's the wrong person for that job. And one of his reasons will be, "I'm no good at public speaking." When actually, what Stephen tells us in Acts is that he was powerful in speech. He was a brilliant orator because it was part of the education he received in Egypt. In fact, scholars tell us that at this point in history, Egypt is the superpower, and it was the place where if you were a king elsewhere in the Mediterranean, you would send your sons to Egypt for their education. It was that good. So one of them, Phil Ryken, says it was customary for foreign-born princes to be reared and educated in the Egyptian court. So Moses would have been trained in linguistics, mathematics, astronomy, architecture, music, medicine, law, and diplomacy. Like, he got a first-rate education. And then Ryken adds these words, which I love. In other words, Moses was trained for Pharaoh's overthrow right under Pharaoh's nose. Don't you love the irony of the story? Moses is terrified of the men of Israel. So God uses the women of Israel to utterly undermine his whole program. Pharaoh is dead scared that they may rise up against him. And so the one Jewish person that is actually allowed into the Egyptian court and given the very best education anywhere in the world at that time is the one who will be the deliverer of Israel. Doesn't God have a great sense of humor at times? The way all of this turns out and unfolds. And what we need to see in this story is that God is at work. Even when we look at a story and go, where on earth is God? Because here's the amazing thing. In Exodus chapter 2, in this story that takes up these first 10 verses, not only are the three heroines of the story, the three women, the mother, the sister, and the princess, none of them are named. They're all anonymous. So's God. God's anonymous. If you've got it open in front of you, just glance through the text again. You will not find the title God or the name Yahweh anywhere in this story. He is utterly absent. And yet, he's not, is he? And friends, I want to suggest that that's actually the very point that Moses, as he crafts this story years later, that's exactly the point that Moses is making. It's the key idea I want you to hear today. Even when God's hand can't be seen, his fingerprints are all over the story. Even when God's hand can't be seen, his fingerprints are all over the story. Because they're all over the story, aren't they? How on earth do you explain that for 3 months a little boy doesn't cry out once so the Egyptian soldiers can hear him? How do you explain that this mother places the baby in the basket in just the right place in this massive river we know as the Nile? How do you explain the fact that an Egyptian princess comes down to bathe at exactly the moment this baby is sitting there in his basket? How do you explain that a 9 or 10-year-old girl has the wisdom and the courage to step forward just at that moment and say what she says? How do you explain that the royal court of Egypt that's ordered the genocide of Jewish boys will pay the boy's mother to raise him for the next few years? How do you explain that the deliverer of Israel will actually be educated in the very court he will come to undermine decades later? See, you don't see God's hand in this story, but my goodness, his fingerprints are all over the story, aren't they? And folks, this happens again and again and again and again through the story of the Bible. At the times where you think that God is absent and not at work and not named, he is everywhere. And he is at work. When I was a teenager, I remember one sermon that my father preached. My dad preached heaps. And I remember one sermon from my teenage years. It was a sermon that he was preaching from the book of Ruth, which is his favorite book in the Bible because that's my mum's name. And he was preaching from Ruth chapter 2, where this Moabite widow is going to harvest some grain. And she goes into the field of a man named Boaz, who, as the story unfolds, will end up becoming her husband. And the King James version of the Bible that I don't use anymore, because it's just got this 400-year-old English in it, and that doesn't make sense to us often. But there's an expression that my dad pulled out that has stuck with me for the last 40 years. Here's what it says in the King James version of Ruth chapter 2. And Ruth went and came and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and her hap was to light on a part of the field belonging unto Boaz. Her hap. Isn't that a cool expression? We don't talk like that anymore, eh? Her hap. The English Standard Version says she happened to go into the field of Boaz. The NIV puts it, as it turned out, She went into Boaz's field. And what the scriptures are silently saying to us is she didn't just happen. It just didn't just turn out. It wasn't just her hap. It wasn't dumb luck. It was the fingerprints of a God who is sovereign in each of our lives. Even when we can't see God's hand, his fingerprints are all over the story. And friends, I want to remind you of that today. I want to remind you that in the times, in the seasons, in the extended moments of life, where you sometimes wonder, where is God? Where you try and look around and you can't see his hand anywhere, I want to tell you, his fingerprints are all over your story. You see, so often we ask the question, where is God when life is so hard and crazy and the bottom has fallen out of life? Do you know where God is? The Bible tells you. He is right there. Because God has promised time and again in his word, never will I leave you and never will I forsake you. And so often we look at our lives and we go, where is God? And the answer is he's right there. And friends, you may not see his hand at work in your life right now, but I want to tell you, his fingerprints are all over your story. Maybe your life is really tough right now. You're in a season of that I just described at the beginning of the service, and you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. I want you to know his fingerprints are on your story. You may be a season where you feel completely stuck and you don't know where you're going next. I want you to know his fingerprints are on your story. You may be a mother right now, looking at the parenting task and going, I don't have a clue what I'm doing. Good news. His fingerprints are all over your story. And it doesn't matter who you are. And it doesn't matter what you're doing. And it doesn't matter what you're facing. Even if you can't see his hand at work, he is still at work. And his fingerprints are all over your story. And here's what I've noticed in life, and I've lived long enough now to see this time and again. There's something magical that happens over the years, where a few years later you will look back on a season in your life where you thought you could not see his hand, and you look back years later and somehow what time has done has sprinkled magical fingerprint dust. And years later you look back and you see it. 5 years ago I burned out and had to step away from being a senior pastor after 20 years. 2 years ago I was diagnosed with bowel cancer and went through a pretty scary journey for a few months. And those are the times where I was tempted to go, where is God? Well, now I look back and his fingerprints are all over my story. And friend, they're all over yours. No matter who you are, no matter what you're facing, or no matter what you're going through. Even when we can't see his hand, his fingerprints are there. So God, we want to say thank you today that that's who you are. You're the God who never leaves us. You're the God who never forsakes us. You're the God who is sovereignly at work in our lives, even when we struggle to see it in the particular moment. So I want to pray for all of us today, but I particularly want to pray for people who are really struggling. I particularly want to pray for people who feel stuck. And I want to particularly pray for all the mothers in the parenting journey, that they would know your fingerprints are all over their lives right now. We thank you for that in Jesus' name. Amen.